In the forgotten folds of Asia's countryside, where the mountains breathe mist and the rivers remember names long buried, there are stories not meant for light. Stories passed from cracked lips to trembling ears, stories whispered at dusk and never spoken at dawn. This is FolkFear, where old rituals never die, where spirits are sealed with hair and blood, where the cursed do not rest. Tonight, we open the earth, and we unearth the bride who was never meant to rise. She has no name, she has no voice. She was promised to the dead, and now she waits beneath the soil. This is the story of the clay bride of Phrai. You may want to leave the light on, but in this village, it's not the dark that haunts you, it's the silence.
The rain never fully stopped in Phrai. It didn't fall with fury, nor did it bring cleansing. It merely hung in the air, thin, damp, and cold, like the breath of something waiting. The clouds above the village moved slowly, like tired ghosts, heavy with secrets too old to forget. Molly pressed her face against the dusty window of the old bus as it rumbled through the muddy paths toward the village. Her mother sat beside her, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. The trees outside twisted like they were hiding something behind their trunks, something they didn't want the world to see. Phrai was where Molly was born, though she had no memories of it. Her mother had taken her away when she was only a baby, fleeing something or someone Molly was never told. And now, after 13 years in the city, they were returning. The excuse was her grandmother's death, but Molly had overheard things in the weeks before, the hushed calls, the way her mother's hands trembled while packing, how she stared too long at old photos with missing faces. The road narrowed, hemmed in by bamboo groves and red clay embankments. The air grew colder. The silence grew louder. The bus stopped at the edge of the village, refusing to go any farther. "No further," the driver muttered. "Too soft. Roads not safe in the rain." He looked at Molly's mother, not unkindly, but with a kind of pity that made Molly's stomach twist. They walked the rest of the way through puddles that never dried and paths that seemed to shift under their feet. The houses in Phrai were old, sagging under the weight of time and memory. Each one had a small spirit house at the corner, draped in marigold garlands and rotting offerings. The smell of damp incense hung in the air, like smoke that had forgotten where it came from. Children peeked out from behind wooden doors, but did not smile. Old women watched from porches, their faces cracked like the bark of ancient trees. No one waved, no one spoke. Molly and her mother arrived at the house just before the rain picked up again. It stood at the far edge of the village, near the temple grounds, where the forest pressed too close and the wind carried sounds it shouldn't. The house smelled of old wood, mold, and a faint trace of something else, something metallic and sour, like old blood sealed behind walls. Her mother busied herself unpacking. Molly wandered. She stepped out back, where the garden had become a swamp of weeds and slippery stone. A narrow trail led from the yard, past the withered banana trees, and toward a moss-covered shrine barely standing. It was a crumbling stone structure, no taller than her chest, with black string tied around its base and broken clay dolls placed neatly at its feet. And beside it stood a figure. It took Molly a moment to register it wasn't human. It was a statue, life-sized, shaped like a woman in a bridal pose, but unfinished. The face was smooth clay, no eyes, no mouth, just the hint of a veil made from what looked like dried banana fiber. The arms were too long. One hand clutched something close to its chest, an object wrapped in red thread, pulsing gently in the wind. She took a step forward. A low hum drifted from behind her. It wasn't a song, not quite. It was more like a vibration, deep and broken. She turned around. Nothing. When she looked back, the statue was gone. Molly didn't scream. She didn't move. She stood there in that muddy patch of earth until her mother called from the house, voice sharp and urgent. That night, the rain tapped on the windows like fingers that had forgotten how to knock. She lay in her grandmother's old room, surrounded by wooden carvings and cracked mirrors. On the ceiling, faint etchings of lotus flowers and skeletal hands peeked through the peeling paint. The walls groaned with every gust of wind. She dreamed of clay. Not just any clay, but living, breathing earth. It wrapped around her arms like vines, soft at first, then suffocating. In her dream, she stood before the statue again, only this time its face was complete. It wore her own. She woke with a gasp, throat dry, skin cold, and in the corner of the room, barely visible in the faint glow of the moon, stood a shape, still, veiled, watching. But when she blinked, it was gone. The next morning, Molly asked her mother about the statue. "There's no statue," she said quickly. "You were dreaming." "It was near the shrine out back." Her mother's lips thinned. "Stay away from that place." "Why?" "It's old. It's dangerous. That part of the land, it doesn't belong to us anymore." That afternoon, Molly wandered again, this time into the heart of the village. She passed the old schoolhouse, where children's laughter once echoed. It now stood silent, its windows broken, its doors chained shut. She found the market, abandoned except for a single stall where an old woman sold herbs and amulets. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, but when she sensed Molly approaching, she smiled without warmth. "You're Tao's kin," the woman said. Molly froze. "Who?" The woman tapped her temple with a bony finger. "She's in you. The land remembers." Molly turned to leave. "Don't refuse the earth," the woman called after her. "It's not kind to daughters who turn their backs." Molly ran. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the temple grounds. There, under a grove of rain-fed trees, stood a faded stone wall. Vines covered most of it, but Molly noticed small carvings hidden beneath it. Brides buried up to their waists, eyes covered, hands bound. Behind the wall, something moved. She stepped closer. From the shadowed trees, a figure stepped out. It was a boy, about her age, dirty, barefoot, but smiling. He held a slingshot and a frog in his other hand. "You're the city girl," he said. "And you're spying on me," she replied. "I live here. Name's Corn." "Did you see a statue yesterday behind my house?" Corn nodded. "The bride?" Molly's heart skipped. "They make one every 7 years, from river clay, to bury it." "Why?" Corn looked around, then leaned in. "To keep something down." "What?" He shrugged. "Nobody says. Just that if we don't do it, she'll come back." Molly didn't ask who she was. That night, she stood at her window again. The mist hung thicker, the rain softer. In the distance, Past the garden and the shrine stood the clay bride once more. This time it was closer, and its face was beginning to take shape. Not fully, but enough that Molly knew it was starting to remember her.
The next morning, the mist clung to the village like a second skin. It curled around rooftops, slithered between the bamboo stalks, and swallowed every sound but the wet shuffle of bare feet on soil. Molly sat on the steps of the house, chewing stale rice and watching the fog breathe. Her mother was inside, lighting incense for her grandmother's altar. The air reeked of old ash and something sharp beneath it. Iron, maybe. Blood, maybe. She didn't ask. Corn arrived just as the sun began to pierce the cloud cover. He held a bundle of dried herbs in one hand and a thin wooden flute in the other. "You shouldn't sit there," he said, pointing at the step beneath her. "That's where your grandmother fed the spirits." Molly blinked. Fed them? Rice, fish heads, bits of her hair sometimes. The spirits here get hungry, especially after dark. She stood, brushing the dust from her skirt. "Are you always this cheerful?" He smiled. "Only when people ask the wrong questions." They wandered into the village together, past leaning houses and gardens thick with decay. Dogs barked from behind gates. Women hushed their conversations when they saw Molly pass. Children looked away. "They don't like outsiders," Corn said. "And to them, you are one, even if you were born here." "But I'm not an outsider. My family's from Phrai." "Your blood's from here, but your mind, it left too long ago." They passed a hut near the edge of the rice fields. An old woman crouched outside, her back curved like a question mark, her fingers weaving black threads into a doll made of bamboo and hair. She looked up as they approached. "Dao's kin," she rasped, the same way the other old woman had said it. Molly stopped. "Why do people keep saying that?" The woman lifted the doll. Its face was blank, just a smear of red where the eyes should be. "She's looking for a daughter." Corn took her hand and pulled her away. "Don't talk to the Mewan-yai," he said, once they were out of earshot. "They're the villagers' memory, and memory's a dangerous thing here." He led her to the river, the one that wrapped around Phrai like a protective serpent. Its banks were swollen from the rains, red clay bleeding into the water like open wounds. Bamboo poles stuck out of the mud like broken bones, each wrapped in faded yellow cloth. Women stood knee-deep in the river, scooping clay into baskets. Their faces were painted with white ash, and their mouths were sewn shut with black thread. No one spoke. No one looked up. "What are they doing?" Molly whispered. Corn didn't answer. They watched in silence as the women carried the clay back to a clearing just beyond the trees. There, under a canopy of twisted branches, stood something that made Molly's chest tighten. It was the bride, or at least the beginning of her. A skeletal frame made of bamboo had been erected. Long strands of blackened fiber hung from the arms like veins. The women began layering the clay onto her body, slowly, with reverence, their hands trembling. They shaped her hips, her chest, her spine. "She's not real," Molly whispered. Corn's voice was quiet. "She's more real than anything else here." One of the women began to chant, not with her mouth, which was bound shut, but from somewhere deeper. The sound came from her throat, low and guttural, like the echo of something buried. The others joined in, humming,
vibrating the air like a hive of bees calling to their queen. The clay bride began to take shape. Molly watched as the figure grew more human with every layer. The ribs were smoothed, the arms rounded, the hollow head pressed and reshaped into something almost feminine. But there were no eyes, no mouth, just a veil of thin bark and strips of red silk tied around where the mouth would be. She shivered. "They bury her," Korn said. "Every 7 years. It's the only way to keep her down." "Who is she?" His voice dropped. "They call her Dao. She was once like you." The name was familiar, too familiar. Molly remembered the journal she'd found yesterday, written in a shaking hand, the paper brittle with age. It had mentioned Dao, a girl forced to marry the dead, a ghost marriage. She was wedded to the corpse of a shaman's son, but she refused. She tried to run, so they punished her. Molly's throat tightened. "They killed her?" "They did worse." He pointed toward the forest beyond the clearing. "They buried her alive, standing, in a bridal gown, hands bound, mouth sewn shut. And when they unearthed her days later, her body was gone. Only the clay was left, shaped like her. And ever since, every 7 years, we give her another body." Molly stepped back. "Why?" "To contain her. If we don't, she finds one herself." That night, Molly couldn't sleep. Her grandmother's house creaked and moaned, the wind slipping through the cracks like whispers in another tongue. She lay under the thin blanket, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each groan in the wood. And then she heard it. Not inside, outside. Soft humming, like before. She got up, barefoot and shaking, and crept toward the back window. The mist was thicker than ever, rolling across the ground in tendrils. The shrine behind the house pulsed with faint light, and standing just beyond it was the bride. But this time, she moved. She watched as the figure turned her head slowly, veil trailing in the wind, the body still incomplete but unmistakably feminine. The arm lifted, pointing toward the house. No, toward her. And then she smiled. Even without a mouth, the smile lived in the air around it, in the pressure inside Molly's ears, in the hollow ache behind her eyes. A smile that didn't need lips, just memory, just pain. She fell backward, scrambling away from the window, knocking over a jar of ashes. Her mother burst into the room moments later, eyes wide, hair undone. "What did you see?" she demanded. "The statue. It's alive. It moved." Her mother paled. "You went near the clearing?" "No, but I saw it." "You shouldn't have looked." "Why do everyone keep saying that?" Her mother knelt beside her, hands shaking. "Because once you see her, she sees you." And in the silence that followed, they both listened. Outside, the humming continued, and beneath it, something else. A slow, wet sound, like clay being molded by unseen hands, over and over and over again. The morning after the humming, Phrai seemed to hold its breath. Even the roosters stayed silent. The mist was gone, but in its place hung a metallic taste in the air, as if the entire village had bled a little in its sleep. Molly walked through the yard barefoot, feeling the damp soil sink under her toes. Her mother had gone to the temple at dawn and had not returned. The house creaked with emptiness, every shadow looking like a person who had just left the room. At the edge of the yard lay the little shrine she had seen so many times. Today, something new waited for her there. A strip of red cloth, damp with something darker, tied in a perfect knot. It wasn't there the night before. It pulsed faintly, as though the wind itself were breathing through it. She picked it up and felt a sting at the tips of her fingers, sharp and sudden, like a paper cut. A single drop of her blood rolled down the cloth and vanished, swallowed instantly. Behind her, a low laugh drifted. She turned and saw Corn crouched by the banana trees, slingshot dangling from his hand. "You shouldn't touch the offerings," he said quietly. "They're not meant for you." "I didn't," she began, but her voice faltered. "They'll think you gave your blood on purpose, and once they think that, the elders will come." He led her away from the shrine, down a narrow path choked with weeds. They walked in silence, the air growing heavier with every step. Soon the path widened into a hidden clearing, one she had not seen before. Bamboo stakes ringed the space like teeth. At the center lay a pit lined with stones blackened by fire. This time there were no women chanting, only one, an elder with hair like ash and eyes like glass. She sat cross-legged beside the pit, humming a low note that vibrated in Molly's ribs. In front of her lay a bundle, cloth, black thread, and a knife so thin it looked like a sliver of moonlight. Molly watched as the elder pricked her own tongue with the knife. A bead of blood formed, dark and slow. She let it drip onto the cloth, then began stitching the thread through the stained fabric. Her lips never moved, but her throat pulsed with the hum. Corn whispered, "This is the tongue rite." "The what?" Molly asked. "She binds her voice into the cloth. Each elder does it once a year. It's how they keep Tao quiet, how they sew her mouth shut again." Molly stared. "With their blood?" He nodded. "And their tongues." The elder looked up. For a moment her face softened, and Molly thought she might smile. But instead, she extended the needle toward her, black thread swinging like a pendulum. "You're late," she croaked. Her voice sounded like two stones grinding together. "Come forward." Molly stepped back. I don't belong here." "Everyone belongs here if they were born of this soil," whispered the elder. Corn tugged her arm. "We should go." But Molly couldn't move. The elder's eyes held her. They weren't cruel, but they were vast, like looking into the well at night and seeing no bottom. The elder pressed the cloth to her own lips and hissed a phrase Molly didn't understand. The pit hissed back, as though the stones themselves were alive. Blood, thread, tongue, bride. Without them, she wakes. The wind rose. The red cloth Molly still held from the shrine fluttered like a living thing. She dropped it. It slithered across the ground and fell into the pit, disappearing. The elder's gaze darkened. "It has chosen you." Corn pulled her hard, and this time she moved. They ran from the clearing, branches clawing at their clothes, the smell of iron chasing them. When they reached the safety of the rice fields, Molly bent over, gasping. "What was that? Why did she say it chose me?" Corn's face was pale. "Because you're Tao's kin. The thread wants the blood it remembers." Molly touched her lip. It was bleeding. She didn't know when it had started. The taste was bitter, earthy. She spit into the mud and watched the red swirl into brown. That night, she dreamed again. She stood in the clearing, but it was deeper now, a cavern beneath the earth. The pit was open, and from it rose hands made of clay, slick and trembling. They reached for her, not to pull her down, but to place something on her tongue, a single black thread, wet and warm. She tried to spit it out, but it burrowed deeper, stitching itself across her mouth. She woke with a muffled cry, clutching her face. The taste of soil was real this time. On the floor beside her bed lay a small clay figurine, shaped like a bride, mouth sealed with red thread. Her mother entered the room and stopped cold. "Where did you get that?" "I don't know," she whispered. "It was here when I woke." Her mother snatched it up and threw it into the hearth, where it cracked and hissed like living flesh. She knelt beside Molly, gripping her shoulders. "You have to stop going near the rituals. Stop asking questions." "They're coming for me, aren't they?" Molly asked. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "They always come for the daughters first." Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it a faint humming, not from one voice, from many, dozens, maybe hundreds. Molly pressed her ears, but the sound wasn't outside anymore. It was inside her.
The river had always been there, before the village, before the shrine, before even the stories. It curved around Phrai like a serpent guarding something sacred, or something cursed. It was both the giver and the taker, the source of life and the keeper of the dead. Molly stood at its edge as dawn broke, the morning fog parting slowly above the water like lungs exhaling. The surface was smooth, too smooth, like glass that had not been disturbed for centuries. It made no sound. It did not ripple, even as the wind whispered through the trees. She crouched by the bank, her hand hovering just above the water. Her reflection stared back, eyes hollow, lips pale, hair falling into her face like shadows. But then something moved behind it. Not a fish, not the current. A face. Feminine. Familiar. Eyeless. Molly fell back, splashing mud onto her legs. She blinked once, twice, and it was gone. The river, again, was still. "You saw her," said a voice behind her. She turned. Corn was there, sitting on a rock as if he had always been. "She comes to the ones the river remembers." "What does that mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a small, waterlogged journal. Its cover was cracked, its pages warped with age and moisture. He said, "I found this near the roots of the old Bodhi tree. It's hers." "Dao's?" He nodded. "Or maybe someone who tried to help her." Molly took the journal carefully. The first few pages were unreadable, smeared with ink and silt. But deeper in, a shaky hand had written, "She was not meant to marry the dead. She was forced, and when she refused, they said she cursed the water. But it was not she who cursed. It was they who broke the sacred promise." Molly looked up. "What promise?" Corn pointed to the river. "That no woman of Phrai would ever be given without consent. A vow the elders made long ago and broke." They walked upstream together, following the curve of the water until the trees grew thicker and the light thinner. The air here smelled different, richer but older, like rotting flowers and forgotten prayers. Eventually, they reached the sacred bend. Here, the river split around a low island of moss and stone. At its center was a raised platform, not natural but carved. Faint symbols lined its sides, faded by centuries of rain.
On top, a hollow depression the size of a human body. Beside it, the remains of old offerings, bones of birds, ash of incense, strands of hair knotted into braids. "This is where they buried her," Korn said softly. "Before the pit, before the rituals, before the clay." Molly stepped closer. She saw a thin red thread tangled in the reeds. When she pulled it free, it came loose with a sudden snap, and the water shifted, just slightly, but enough. Something surfaced. It wasn't a body. It was a doll, small, crude, shaped of clay, but its face was exact. It was Molly's. She dropped it with a cry. The current carried it away. Korn looked pale. "You've been chosen." "I didn't ask for this." "No one ever does." They ran back to the village, the trees behind them groaning like something waking. When they reached Molly's house, her mother was waiting on the porch. But she wasn't alone. 3 women in gray robes stood beside her, elders. Their mouths were sealed with black thread, but their eyes burned with knowledge and old pain. One held a bowl filled with river water. Another carried a bundle of red cloth. The third opened her hand to reveal a tooth, small, childlike, coated in clay. "We come to bind," one whispered, the thread between her lips vibrating like a spider's web. "No," Molly's mother said sharply. "She hasn't accepted." The elder shook her head. "She was seen. The bride took her image. The choice is not hers anymore." They turned and left without another word. Molly couldn't sleep that night. She kept the journal close, reading and rereading the brittle pages. One line echoed in her mind, scratched over and over like a warning etched by shaking hands. "The river does not forget. It remembers every lie, every daughter, every scream." When sleep finally took her, it did not come gently. She found herself floating in water, not drowning, but not breathing either. Around her, women stood beneath the surface, eyes shut, mouths open in silent wails. Their hair moved like seaweed, wrapping around her limbs, pulling her gently downward. One of them reached for her face, and as she touched Molly's cheek, her skin cracked, revealing clay underneath, veined, breathing. She screamed and woke. Only it wasn't her room. She was standing in the pit, alone. The bride towered above her, half-built, her face unfinished, but her hands were reaching down, open, beckoning. And in one of them, she held the little clay doll with Molly's face. The next morning, the mist returned, thicker this time, not curling, but clinging, like it had been waiting in the trees for something. The villagers moved through it without comment, their faces unreadable, their mouths stitched tight with silence. Something had shifted. Molly felt it the moment she opened her eyes, a heaviness in the air, in her bones, like the ground itself was watching her. Her mother was already awake, kneeling before the family altar, whispering a prayer Molly didn't recognize. Not Thai, not even Pali. It was older, rounder vowels, breathier syllables. A language passed down, mouth to mouth, tongue to tongue, never written. The kind of prayer that could only live if it was feared. Molly waited, but her mother didn't stop. The incense curled upward like fingers reaching toward something unseen. Outside, drums began. Soft at first, a single heartbeat, then joined by others, scattered across the village, their rhythm slow and deliberate, like feet dragging through wet clay. Today was the day. The making of the bride was complete, and now the offering would begin. At the center of the village stood the pit. It was deeper than Molly remembered, dug by hand, lined with stones darkened by time and soot. At its edge, the clay bride stood tall, nearly lifelike now. Her body sculpted in perfect proportions, her arms slightly raised, her face covered with a veil woven from moss and bark, dripping with red-dyed silk threads. She was beautiful in the way forgotten things are beautiful. Ancient, solemn, aching with stories no one dared tell. Around the pit, the women gathered. Each carried a small blade. Each held a strip of white cloth. Each wore the same expression, resignation. The drums slowed, then stopped. One by one, the women stepped forward, pricked their thumbs, and let their blood stain the cloth. They whispered something over it, then placed it at the feet of the clay bride. Offerings. Molly stood at the edge, heart hammering. She felt eyes on her, dozens, maybe hundreds, not all of them human. Corn was beside her, but even he looked different, drawn, pale, afraid. An elder approached, holding out a blade and a fresh strip of cloth. Her eyes were milky, but unblinking. "It is your time," she said. Molly shook her head. "I never agreed." The elder didn't flinch. The river did. Her mother stepped forward. "She's not ready." The elder's jaw tightened. "If she does not give, the bride will take." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Molly looked at the cloth, the blade, the statue. Her hands shook, but something inside her, something quiet and stubborn, refused. "I won't," she whispered. "I won't give her my blood." A long silence followed, and then, without warning, the drums resumed. But this time they were faster, frenzied. The sky darkened. Thunder rolled, not from above, but from beneath the earth, deep and low like a voice stirring from sleep. The clay bride shuddered. It was subtle, but everyone saw it. A ripple across her chest, a twitch in her arm, a thread unraveling from her veil and lifting into the air like it had a will of its own. The elders screamed. The villagers scattered. Only Molly remained, frozen. The bride turned her head, just slightly, just enough. Molly backed away, but her foot caught the edge of the pit, and she fell. The ground rose around her like a mouth closing. She scrambled to her feet, panting. And then the bride's veil slipped, and Molly saw her own face beneath it. Not a replica, not a mask, her own, but changed, cracked, filled with something wet and breathing beneath the clay. She screamed, and the earth answered. The pit split, the stones cracked. A foul wind burst upward, carrying the scent of rot and wet hair. Molly clawed her way out, coughing, crying. Her mother pulled her free. Corn dragged them both away from the collapsing edge as the pit swallowed the offerings. The blood-soaked cloths vanished into the earth. The statue remained, but her head was turned, facing the house, facing Molly. That night no one lit candles. No prayers were spoken. The drums did not return. The villagers locked their doors, sealed their windows, and buried their faces in their pillows. But Molly lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart echoing the rhythm of the forgotten drums. Outside her window, something stood in the garden, not quite moving, but waiting. When she looked again, it was gone. In its place, On the window ledge was a folded strip of red cloth, still damp, still warm. Her name was written on it, in clay.
The village didn't speak of what had happened at the pit. They swept the clay dust away. They scrubbed the blood from the earth. They whispered behind closed doors and locked their shrines with an extra knot of red thread. But the silence was heavier than any truth. Molly sat by the window, the red cloth with her name still folded in her lap. No one had claimed it. No one had explained how it had come to be. It smelled faintly of jasmine and something else, something older, like river silt and old teeth. The clay bride had turned. That had never happened before. Even Corn admitted it. They say she only moves when the offering is refused, he said, pacing back and forth beside the house. But no one's refused in decades, maybe longer. Then how do they know? Molly asked. He stopped, looked at her. They don't. That night, Molly heard it again, the humming. But this time, it wasn't from outside. It was in her pillow. When she lifted it, she found strands of hair, long, black, and wet. They coiled around her fingers like veins. Her breath caught. Her skin crawled. She threw the pillow aside, but the humming remained, inside her ears, inside her spine. She ran to her mother's room. The door was open. Her mother sat on the floor, knees tucked beneath her, facing the altar. A candle burned low beside her, its wax pooled into the shape of a face. "May?" she whispered. Her mother didn't turn. Instead, she raised a comb and dragged it through her hair. Only, it wasn't her hair. It was too long, too black, too heavy. Her hands moved mechanically, combing, even as strands fell in clumps to the floor, each one twitching like it was still alive. "I saw her," Molly said softly. "The bride, she had my face." Her mother paused, and then said without looking back, "She had mine too, once." Molly froze. "What?" Her mother finally turned. There were deep hollows beneath her eyes. Her lips were pale, her skin almost translucent. "She comes to us," she whispered, "all the women of our line. She chooses from blood, from memory, from betrayal." "You knew this?" "I tried to keep you away." Molly stepped closer. "Who was Tao to us?" Her mother's voice cracked. "My grandmother's sister, the first bride, the one who was promised, then buried." Molly's heart pounded. "And you never told me?" Her mother smiled weakly. "Would you have believed me?" Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Bamboo knocked against each other like bones in a shrine. She was a healer, kind but poor. When the shaman's son died, they said she had to marry his spirit to seal a bargain made long ago. She refused. "And they killed her?" "No," her mother whispered. "They married her anyway. They buried her in the bridal pit, standing upright, bound in bark and thread, hair shaved, eyes covered, tongue cut." Molly's stomach turned. She lived 3 days underground. The elders took turns whispering blessings through the soil. They said if they kept chanting, she wouldn't die angry, but she did. A silence fell between them, and then Molly asked, almost too softly to hear, "Is she me?" Her mother said nothing. That night, Molly dreamed again. She was walking through the forest, barefoot,
her feet sinking into wet leaves and broken dolls. The trees whispered her name, but not in her voice, in dozens of voices, women's voices, voices without mouths. She came to a clearing. The bride stood there, but this time the veil was lifted, and underneath there was no face, just hair. Endless, writhing, black hair. It poured from the neck down, spilling onto the ground, coiling through roots, rising toward the sky. The bride stepped forward, and as she did, the hair parted, revealing Molly's eye, just one, weeping clay. She woke with a scream. The window was open. The red cloth was gone, and in its place, tied neatly to the sill, was a lock of black hair, braided, damp, still warm. Her mother found her sitting on the floor at sunrise, shaking, clutching her knees. "They won't stop. They want me to become her." Her mother sat beside her. "They don't want you to become her. They want you to remember her." Later that day, Molly and Corn returned to the river. The sacred bend had changed. The water was higher. The carvings along the river stone had grown darker, more defined. And on the small island in the middle, there was a new offering, a wedding sash, red, torn, floating. "She's waking," Corn said. "The elders won't admit it, but the signs are everywhere." "What happens if she fully wakes?" Molly asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the trees. Dozens of clay dolls hung from the branches, all of them shaped like brides, all of them facing away. But one was turned toward them. It had no face, just hair. Corn reached into his pocket and pulled out the journal again. "There's one last entry," he said. "You should read it." Molly took it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was rushed, erratic. "The veil is not to cover her shame. It is to bind her eyes from seeing the blood of her daughters. But when one refuses to bleed, the veil comes undone. And when the veil lifts, the hair beneath remembers every woman who forgot her." She looked up, and the trees began to hum. It began with whispers in the walls, not words, not language, but the sound of breath drawn between teeth, the sound of memory being shaped, the sound of someone sculpting silence into something that could speak. The clay in Molly's dreams had started to talk. She didn't know when it began, only that now, when she woke, her hands were covered in dirt and her nails rimmed with black soil. Each morning, the smell of the river clung to her clothes. Her hair was heavier, damp even when she hadn't bathed. And sometimes, when she passed a mirror, her reflection would pause just for a second before moving with her again. Something was wrong. Something was speaking through her. Molly sat by the cold hearth, staring at a small lump of red clay in her palm. She didn't remember picking it up, but it was warm, too warm, and pulsing ever so faintly, like a living thing trying to remember how to breathe. She closed her fist around it, and the whisper came again. A voice inside her chest, feminine, breathless, furious. "They buried me before I could scream." Molly's heart pounded. She dropped the clay. It hit the floor with a soft thud, then rolled slowly toward the shrine in the corner. The candle on the altar flickered out. Outside, a bell rang once, and then again. The temple bell hadn't rung in years. Her mother rushed in, pale and wild-eyed. "Stay here." But Molly followed. through the mist-thick village, toward the temple gates, now cracked open. The bell continued to toll, each note slower, heavier. It sounded like it was being rung underwater. Inside the temple courtyard, the elders stood in a circle. In the center, the clay bride. But this wasn't the statue from before. This one was new, unfinished, still soft, still breathing. And her face was almost Molly's. Not quite, but close enough that her stomach turned. The villagers gathered slowly. No one spoke, no one blinked. An elder stepped forward, voice hoarse. "She is forming herself now." Molly whispered, "What does that mean?" The elder turned. Her face was streaked with tears and ash. "It means she no longer waits for us to offer. She is choosing her vessel." Molly backed away. "She's not choosing me. She's angry. I see her in my dreams. She's made of fire and clay and blood. She wants to destroy this place." "No, she wants to be heard." The bride's head tilted slightly. The clay cracked around her neck, and from inside a voice came, not from her mouth, but from her chest. Deep, layered, hundreds of voices speaking in unison. "Where are the daughters who forgot me?" The villagers fell to their knees. Molly couldn't move. The statue lifted one hand, fingers still wet. She pointed toward Molly, and the clay on Molly's hands began to burn. She cried out, but no flame was there. Only the memory of heat, the memory of pain passed down like a curse through blood and silence. The elders rushed forward with ropes and incense, chanting in their stitched-tongue language. They threw white ash onto the figure. The clay hissed. It screamed, not from the mouth, from the earth. The temple cracked. The ground shook. And then, silence. When Molly opened her eyes again, the statue was still, but her face was finished now. Perfect, identical. Molly's. That night, the clay spoke again, but this time it didn't whisper. It sang. A lullaby in a voice Molly almost remembered, a tune she had never been taught, but somehow knew. It curled beneath her bed, rose from the cracks in the wall, drifted from the basin of water near the door. She looked at her hands. They were streaked with dried clay. She didn't remember touching any. Her nail fingers were full of soil. When she lit the candle on her bedside, she found something on the floor. A new doll. Small, crude, its mouth sealed with tread, its face her own. The next day, Corn took her to a hill above the village where the clay was harvested. The river was visible from here, snaking between trees like a scar. "I don't know what's happening anymore," Molly said. Corn didn't answer right away. Then he pulled something from his bag, a shard of pottery, ancient and curved, etched with a name. Not Tao, but Molly. "I found this buried in the clay. It was sealed in a jar. You've been chosen before." "What does that mean?" "It means this isn't your first life." Molly stared at the shard. Suddenly the dreams made sense. The pull she felt near the shrine. The way the bride's voice echoed from inside her ribs. "I think," she whispered, "I'm not just her kin. I think I'm what's left of her." Corn reached for her hand. "Then you need to decide if you'll finish what she started or bury it again." Far below, the clay bride remained in the temple, still, but smiling. They told the story like a fable. A girl named Tao, a shaman's son, a ghost marriage to keep peace between the worlds. Tao refused. The spirits grew angry. To protect the village, the elders performed the rite, binding her to the dead through sacred soil, prayer, and sacrifice. But that was not the truth, and Molly was about to see it for herself. The dreams had changed, no longer fractured, no longer floating. They came now like memories, clear, vivid, real. Molly stood in a longhouse she'd never seen in waking life, but instinctively knew. Clay lamps flickered on the walls. Mats woven from river grass lined the floor. Incense smoke curled in thick spirals. And in the center, Tao knelt. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't resisting. She was still. Her wrists were bound with white thread. Her lips were sewn shut with a needle of bone, and her eyes, open, clear, stared straight ahead, not at the dead body before her, but at the elders who circled her. They wore masks of wood and ash, painted with the symbols of the old gods. Their chanting was not prayer, it was punishment. Every syllable was laced with blame. One stepped forward, the tallest. He carried a bowl filled with red water. He dipped a brush of human hair into it and painted the mark of binding on Tao's chest, the same symbol Molly had seen in the river, the same one she'd found carved behind the shrine. Then they buried her, not in a coffin, not in ceremony, but in silence, alive. Molly woke with her pillow soaked in tears and her hands stained with dried clay. Her mother sat at the edge of the bed, holding something wrapped in fabric. "You're ready to see it now," she said. The bundle was small, heavy, wrapped in red bridal cloth. Inside, bones. Not many, just fingers and a jaw. Beside them, a bridal sash, torn and crusted with what looked like old wax and blood. "She was never married to a spirit," her mother whispered. "That was the lie. The elders were afraid of her. She knew the old magic. She could see the sickness in crops, the poison in wells. They said no woman should hold that kind of power." "So they silenced her?" Molly said. "No," her mother said softly. "They buried her." Molly and Corn followed the stream past the temple, deeper into the forest than they had ever gone. The trees grew thicker, the branches lower, the light thinner, until they reached it, an altar carved into the stone itself, hidden by vines and thyme. The bridal altar. This was where it had happened, the real place, not the pit, not the shrine. Here. The earth around it was disturbed, as if it had been dug and refilled again and again. Molly stepped forward. The moment her fingers touched the stone, the vision came. Not a dream, not memory. Possession. She was Tao. Kneeling, bound, the veil tight across her mouth. She could feel the dirt beneath her nails, the weight of betrayal in her chest. She screamed, but no sound came. Only the sound of shovels and chanting, and the brush of silk as they lowered the dead man's corpse beside her. He was already rotting, his eyes sewn shut, his mouth open. And when they buried her, they placed his cold hand on her stomach, like a blessing, like a claim. Molly tore herself free from the vision with a gasp. Her skin was slick with sweat. The altar was wet beneath her hands. Corn stood nearby, pale and shaken. "What did you see?" "She didn't die angry. She died humiliated." Corn nodded slowly. "That's why the rituals never work. They're not to appease a ghost. They're to hide a crime." They dug beneath the altar with hands and sticks until they reached something solid. A box. Inside, more bones, and a braid of hair perfectly preserved, bound with gold thread. Corn stared. That's hers. Molly held it close. The hair was cold, but it pulsed in her hands, alive with memory. She was never a bride, she said. She was a warning. Behind them, the trees shifted. The air grew colder, and the clay began to rise from the earth. A figure, half-formed, took shape, emerging not from a mold, but from the ground itself. She had no face, but she had eyes, and they were open. There was no hiding anymore. Not for Molly, not for her mother, not for the village. The truth had been unearthed, and it clung to the air like smoke that couldn't be fanned away. The clay bride no longer waited in shrines or pits. She followed. She watched. She breathed. And the villagers began to whisper the old words again. To stop the rot, burn the root. It began with the wells. The water turned black at the bottom, thick, still. Frogs died, floating with their legs curled tight. Clothes washed in the river came out stained red. The rice paddies bubbled with air that stank of rotting teeth. They said the earth was turning against them. But it wasn't the earth. It was her. Tao, and the blood that still carried her name. Molly sat on the porch, staring at the sky. It hadn't rained in 4 days. The clouds looked too low, like they wanted to fall but forgot how. Even the birds had stopped calling. Her mother came out holding a bundle of cloth. "I want to show you something," she said quietly. They sat together in the back room, the one they never used. Her mother lit a single oil lamp and unwrapped the bundle. Inside were 3 things: an old photograph, a lock of braided hair tied with black string, and a tiny clay amulet shaped like a face. Molly stared at it. The face was her own, but aged, hollowed, tired. "That's you," her mother said, "or it will be." The photograph was cracked and faded. A young girl, barefoot, dressed in white, stood beside the shrine at the river bend. Her mouth was sewn shut in the photo. Literally, thread had been stitched across the print. "Is that?" "My aunt," her mother said. "Dao's daughter, or so the elders claimed. She bled to death the day after that photo was taken. The thread had been pushed too deep. The body rejected silence." Molly's voice broke. "Why didn't you ever leave this place?" Her mother stared at the flame. "Because leaving doesn't break a curse. It carries it farther." The elders called a meeting at the temple. No bells, no drums, just the sound of sandals on stone. Molly and her mother stood in the center, surrounded by villagers who wouldn't meet their eyes. Even corn was missing. Elder Saw, the oldest among them, stepped forward. Her lips were no longer sealed by thread. The stitches had burst, leaving deep scars across her mouth. She spoke with a rasp. "The river is angry. The bride walks. The clay has cracked." Silence. She turned to Molly. "There is only one way to return her to the ground." Molly's hands trembled. "You want to bury me?" Her mother stepped forward. "No." 2 men seized her by the arms. "No," she screamed. "You said it would end with me." Saw's voice was calm. "It will." Molly felt her breath leave her chest. Her feet dragged as they pulled her toward the altar. The villagers did nothing, not even the ones who had once smiled at her. not even the children. They laid her on the cold stone. Above her, the clay bride watched from her new place at the shrine's edge. Her arms were open now, her mouth unsealed. Her face was still Mali's, the same eyes, but older, wiser, tired. Sa dipped a reed into a bowl of river clay and began painting symbols on Mali's arms. They say if the body accepts the mark willingly, the spirit will sleep. Mali closed her eyes. She saw Tao again, not in a dream, but in a memory that wasn't hers. Buried alive, standing, blindfolded, her screams choking on dirt, and above her elders chanted, not out of fear, but cruelty, not to save the village, but to silence the truth. Mali sat up. The bowl of clay fell from Sa's hands. "I remember," she said softly. Her voice was different now, layered, two-toned. It was her voice, and another, older, angrier. She stood. The villagers stepped back. The clay bride cracked where she stood. A line split her chest. Her arms dropped to her sides. Mali touched her own cheek, and from her skin, clay fell in flakes. Her voice deepened. "I am not your sacrifice." The earth trembled, the altar cracked, the temple groaned, and for the first time in generations, the villagers looked at what they had done and saw monsters. Not spirits, not ghosts, themselves. Mali stepped down from the altar. No one stopped her. Her mother followed, blood on her hands from where she had fought the ropes. Together, they walked out of the temple, past the veiled statues, past the hushed mouths. Behind them, the clay bride collapsed. Dust to dust. But the curse was not gone. It had simply remembered its name. The earth did not shake. The sky did not split. The world did not end. But something ended. Something broke. And in its quiet collapse, something far older began to stir. Molly stood at the edge of the pit, the same one the villagers had prepared for her, the same pit they had used over and over for generations, burying silence beneath thread and blood and lies. Now it was open once more. The wind circled the rim in slow spirals, carrying with it the scent of ash, river clay, and forgotten hair. The bride no longer stood beside it. She had crumbled at the temple, her face shattered in the moment Molly spoke Tao's name aloud. But Molly still felt her presence, just beneath her skin, just behind her breath. The elders no longer spoke. They remained in their homes, burning bitter herbs and nailing red talismans to their door frames. The village had gone still again, not in peace, but in fear, as if they knew the curse had shifted and that it now had a voice and feet and a name they could no longer erase. Corn was waiting at the edge of the rice paddies. "I shouldn't have left you," he said. "You didn't," Molly replied. "Everyone else did." He looked at her differently now, like she was both someone he knew and someone he had never met. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To finish it." "To break the curse?" She shook her head. "No, to bury the truth where it belongs." That night, Molly returned to the pit, alone. The moon hung low, wrapped in a veil of mist. She wore white, not a dress, but a simple linen wrap, soaked in river water and laced with strands of hair pulled from the oldest offering dolls she could find. Around her wrists, she tied bark thread. Around her mouth, Nothing. She would not be silenced. Not again. The descent into the pit was slow. Each step downward felt like a lifetime. The walls were slick with clay. Fingerprints of other women lined the edges, some shallow, some deep, some smeared as if clawing. At the bottom, the air was damp and tight, and she was not alone. They stood in the walls. Not bodies, not ghosts, impressions, shapes molded from earth, still faintly breathing, dozens of them, hundreds. Women, daughters, mothers, all without names, all buried beneath one lie. Molly knelt. She pressed her palms to the floor of the pit where the old stones were darkest and closed her eyes. I remember you. The air held its breath. I remember what they did. A breeze touched her cheek from underground. And I will not forget. She reached into her wrap and pulled out the braid, Dow's hair, still bound in gold thread, still warm. She placed it into the clay at her knees. The earth pulsed once, then again. The walls shifted, the imprints deepened. From the soil a sound began, low, guttural, layered, not speech, sobbing. She was not afraid, not anymore. She sat cross-legged, her hands in the clay, and let it crawl over her skin, not to trap her, but to hold her, to know her, to name her, to unbury what had never been allowed to speak. And then the voice came, clear, direct, inside her spine. Will you carry us? She did not answer with words. She opened her mouth and began to sing. It was not a melody she had ever heard, but it lived in her bones. It rose from her lungs like steam from sacred earth. Her voice layered with others, as if the pit itself remembered every daughter who had been buried and given no name. The clay rose to her waist, to her chest, to her throat. She did not move. She did not run. This was not her death. This was her return. Above the pit, the villagers gathered in silence. They had come not to honor, but to see if she would die. They stood with torches and thread, not to save her, but to seal her again. But as dawn broke, the earth did not shake. The pit did not collapse. And then she rose. Slowly, steadily, covered in clay from crown to heel, her eyes glowing faintly with the fire of memory. But she was not possessed. She was not cursed. She was whole, and no one dared speak. The villagers parted as she walked between them, not as a ghost, not as a bride, but as the truth made flesh. The bride with no name now had one, Molly, and she would not be forgotten. The ground was supposed to hold them. The pit was supposed to seal them. The rituals were supposed to silence them. But the earth was tired, and the silence had cracked. It began with the shrine bells, all of them, ringing at once. No wind, no hands, just a chorus of broken metal vibrating against the bones of the village. Molly woke before the sound. She had not slept, not since the night she rose from the pit, wrapped in clay and memory. She sat at the edge of her bed, watching the candlelight flicker against the floor, casting shadows that breathed. Her skin still held traces of hardened soil, Lines across her arms like veins turned to riverbank cracks. Outside, the sky had turned the color of wet stone. The mist was gone. What remained was something heavier, stiller. Her mother stood in the doorway. "You're shaking," she said. "I'm listening," she whispered. "To what?" "The ones who are rising." The first body was found behind the temple, or what was left of it. Elder Sa, face frozen mid-prayer, tongue missing, clay sealed across her eyes, pressed there like a kiss. The villagers buried her in silence. But that night she returned, standing in the rice fields, her feet sunken into the earth, her fingers twitching like they were still stitching something that wasn't finished. By morning, she was gone again, and in her place stood a doll, shaped like a bride, mouth open, hair braided with human teeth. The village fractured. Some tried to flee, but the roads twisted. Every path led back. Every trail curved into itself, like a snake devouring its tail. The outsiders, those who had married into Phrai or settled in ignorance, begged the elders for mercy. But the elders no longer spoke. Their tongues had been claimed in the night, some ripped out, some sewn shut, some turned to clay mid-sentence. The rituals they once relied on had turned against them, and the earth was rejecting the lie. Molly wandered through the forest with her bare feet sinking into soft soil. She no longer feared the trees or the shrines. She understood now. They were not haunted. They were holding on. To rage, to grief, to names never spoken. She reached the old burial grounds just before sunset. The graves had cracked open, not from weather, not from age, but from refusal. Refusal to stay buried. Women stood in the fog, not living, not rotting, just formed, like memories pulled from soil. Each one wore a veil, each veil woven from red thread and hair. They stared at Molly, not with hunger, not with blame, but with knowing. She stepped forward. "You remember," she said. They nodded. She whispered, "Then help me show them." That night, Molly stood at the center of Phrai, where the pit once was. The ground beneath her pulsed with breath. She raised her hands, and from the shadows came the daughters. Not just Tao, all of them, the forgotten brides, the nameless women, the ones buried for peace, for silence, for tradition. They walked without sound, but the air trembled. The villagers watched from their homes, pressed against their windows, clutching amulets that lost their power. And one by one, their homes began to bleed clay, from walls, from cracks, from their own mouths. The curse did not roar, it whispered. You tried to bury us, but you planted us instead. The wind carried the words like pollen. The earth groaned, not in pain, but in relief. Molly closed her eyes and felt the river beneath her feet. Not water, but voices, flowing, calling, singing. She pressed her palms to the ground, and it opened, not to swallow her, but to breathe her in. She sank into the earth like a seed, and from her skin the clay began to bloom.
They say when the dead grieve, the sky forgets how to rain. And in Phrai, the sky had been holding back for too long.
Now it only wept from the ground. The veils began to appear overnight, hung from trees, draped across doorways, nailed to the edges of shrines. 7 of them, each one woven from a different thread: bark, bone, silk, ash, riverweed, hair, and something that pulsed faintly when touched. Bloodline thread. Not dyed red, but born red. The villagers knew what it meant. The mourning had begun. But it wasn't for the dead. It was for the living, for those who had survived by forgetting. Mali rose from the earth, not as a ghost, not as a bride, but as the clay's final shape. Her skin was no longer hers. It was layered, memory pressed into memory, grief hardened by silence. Hair tied in loops down her spine, braided into old bridal knots. Her eyes were rimmed with coal made from the ash of forgotten names. Her voice, when it came, was neither loud nor sharp, but echoed like thunder beneath still water. Corn was the first to see her. He didn't run. He dropped to his knees, not out of fear, but recognition. "It's you," he whispered. "It's them," she corrected. She walked past him toward the village square. The sky above did not move. The clouds hung like breath, too heavy to exhale. Molly stepped into the center, and the ground beneath her turned soft, clay rising to meet her feet. She spread her arms, and the 7 veils lifted from their places. They floated to her, slow and soundless. One by one, they wrapped around her body. Each veil whispered as it touched her skin. For the daughter who was offered before her first blood. For the widow forced to marry a name carved in bone. For the midwife whose voice was sealed with wax. For the child buried so her father's sins could be forgiven. For the sister traded for rain. For the mother who forgot her own name, and for the one who returned. When the last veil touched her, the villagers emerged. They came not to confront, but to kneel, even the elders, their mouths still scarred from old thread, their prayers now silent. Molly opened her eyes. "I am not here to curse you," she said. Her voice was like wind moving through trees hollowed by time. "But I will not carry your shame." She pointed to the pit. "Bury your silence and cleanse your hands." No one moved. So Molly did. She walked to the river, veils trailing behind her like old gods being pulled back to their origin. The water parted where she stepped, not out of power, but respect. She stepped into the deepest part, and the veils unwrapped themselves, rising above the water like breath leaving a dying body. Each one became a figure. Each figure became a name, and each name became a song. The water turned red, but not with blood, with memory. Corn stood on the bank. He saw her submerged, but not drowning. He saw her weep, but not suffer. He saw her vanish beneath the surface, and the river fall silent. The sky opened then, and it rained for the first time in months. Not hard, but steady, cleansing. And when the villagers came to the river in the morning, they found 7 veils hanging from the trees, still wet, still warm. And in the mud near the bank, a single footprint, pressed deep, still breathing.
There are silences that heal, and there are silences that rot. Phrai had long forgotten the difference. Now, in the space left behind by the veils, silence took on a new shape, not empty, not calm, but dense. A silence made of all the things never said aloud. It pressed against walls, clung to rooftops, curled beneath the floorboards. The village held its breath, waiting, listening for what would come next. Molly did not return from the river, not as a girl, not as a ghost, not in the way the villagers had expected. But her absence was not empty. It was everywhere. The rice fields bloomed faster. The water ran clearer. Children woke from nightmares without crying. But the villagers did not celebrate, because they knew this peace was not forgiveness. It was pause, the kind before a storm that doesn't come from the sky. Corn wandered the riverbank every day. He followed the path Molly had taken into the water, tracing her steps in the dried mud. Some mornings he found fresh footprints, but they always vanished before they reached the forest, like the earth itself had learned to swallow gently. He spoke her name aloud, but the trees only answered in wind. Still, he knew she was near, not above, not below, but within. One evening he returned to the pit. It had been filled in, covered with smooth river stones and a ring of flowers no one had planted. At its center stood a shrine, small, new. A single clay figure rested on its altar, not veiled, not sealed. Her mouth was open, her eyes wide, and her hands cupped forward, not in prayer, but in offering. Inside them, a single red thread, coiled like a heartbeat. The villagers began to change, slowly, reluctantly, but unmistakably. No one stitched their lips anymore. No one offered blood into bowls. They no longer called her the bride. They began to call her Molly, and for the first time they spoke her name without fear. The women gathered at the river to wash their hair, once forbidden after sundown. They told stories beneath the Bodhi trees, lighting candles not for protection, but for remembrance. They stopped building clay figures. They let the old ones crack and crumble. They let the silence be broken. But silence, once shattered, has sharp edges. One night, a girl named Lynn disappeared, only 7 years old, gone from her bed before dawn. No signs of struggle, only her pillow soaked in river water. They searched for days. On the 4th morning, her mother found her standing at the edge of the pit shrine, alive, dry, smiling, and in her hands, damp with clay, she held a doll. A small figure, mouth open, hair braided, not sealed, and in the doll's chest, a tiny folded note, scrawled in red ink. She listens now. Molly's mother left the village soon after. She did not take the altar. She did not take the amulet. She left behind her old clothing, her stitched veils, her silence. At the edge of the forest, she turned one last time and whispered, "I am not sorry." And the wind replied, "Then you are free." In the weeks that followed, rain came gently, never storms, never floods, just enough to soften the soil,
to help things grow. The villagers rebuilt the temple, not as a place of offering, but of story. They etched new names into its walls, not elders, not men, but the daughters, Dao, Mali, and every unnamed bride that had once been buried beneath the weight of silence. Children ran barefoot across the earth that had once swallowed their mothers. And when they asked about the pit, the women would smile and say, "That's where we buried our forgetting." But Corn still returned to the river each dusk. He sat on the bank and waited, not to see her, not to summon her, but to listen. And every now and then, when the air grew thick and the mist curled low, he would hear it, a hum, soft, layered, older than language. And when he looked to the water, he'd see ripples forming in a perfect circle, as if someone was walking beneath it, slow, unburdened, free. Years passed. Seasons moved like breath, slow, steady, almost tender. Ban Phrai changed, or perhaps it remembered how to become something else. There were no more pits, no more veils sewn in secret, no more clay brides waiting behind shrines with their mouths sealed and their eyes blindfolded. The rituals were gone, but not the memory. Memory stayed. It lived in the earth. It lived in the river. And it lived in the stories told at dusk, when the light bent low and the air thickened with something older than weather. A family moved into the village during the planting season. City people, foreign to the soil. They came looking for quiet, for air, for roots. The house they bought was the one near the river, the one with the bowed fence and the garden that never grew straight. The villagers smiled politely, but they said nothing of the pit, nothing of the veils, nothing of the girl who once walked out of the clay and taught the earth how to speak. The family brought a daughter, 6 years old, curious, quiet, but not afraid. She spent her mornings chasing frogs, and her evenings watching the sun sink into the trees like a secret. Her parents worried about her silence. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her voice was always calm, as if she knew more than she let on. One evening, as the monsoon clouds gathered far in the distance, the girl wandered behind the house and found a stone nestled beneath the moss. She brushed it clean with her hand. It was warm. She dug around it just a little and found more stones laid in a circle, flat and wide, like a hidden mouth waiting to be remembered. At the center, a doll, clay, small, old, but somehow untouched. Its face was simple, softly shaped, no veil, no seal. Its mouth was open, and inside the mouth something shimmered, a single thread, red, still tied at both ends. The girl didn't scream. She smiled. She lifted the doll gently, brushing off the earth. And somewhere inside her, something shifted. Not violently, not darkly, just opened. That night, she didn't speak at dinner. But before bed, she asked her mother a single question. "Do you believe in brides that never get married?" Her mother laughed. "Where did you hear that?" The girl just smiled, from the clay. The next day, she returned to the stone circle. The doll was gone. In its place, a footprint, small, bare, pressed into the mud like a whisper. She pressed her own foot beside it. It matched exactly. She didn't tell anyone, but that night she dreamed of a girl in white standing in the river, eyes clear, hair braided, arms open, not for help, not for fear, but for memory. And when the girl awoke, she found her hands covered in red dust. She didn't wash it off. She pressed her palms to her bedroom wall and left the mark there. 2 handprints, side by side, still damp, still breathing. In Phrai, the wind still carries a hum. The trees still hold their breath at midnight, and the river still runs deep, too deep for its size. But no one buries brides anymore. No one stitches mouths shut. And when the children play near the shrine, the mothers do not call them back in fear, only in respect, only with a smile, only with a story of a girl who remembered, of a bride who became a voice, and of a silence that once tried to hold her, but could not. The clay remains, soft, listening, waiting, not for vengeance, not for sacrifice, but for the next daughter, not to bury, not to mourn, but to remember.